Hello and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today's discussion is going to be about ecological succession. And when we talk about ecological succession, what we're really talking about is the progression of the states of an ecosystem. And so if you think about early Earth, for instance, you're talking about just rock and water. And so the question is, how do you go from rock to the large, beautiful forests that we have today? Alright, so this is what I just said, and it turns out that you can have, most of the time when you have this kind of situation, it's because there's been a disturbance of some sort. And we'll talk about what those disturbances are in just a second. But all ecosystems are actually in a constant state of change all the time. Sorry about that interesting typo. You can cross that all off the end of that sentence. But the point is that you may have ecosystems that are arrested in various stages of succession, but all ecosystems are progressing towards this mature state. And so there are two kinds of succession. There's primary succession, and this begins from an abiotic environment, and this is usually a cataclysmic disturbance. This is something that's actually going to wipe away all of the soil or anything. A volcanic eruption is a really good example, mudslide, something like that. In secondary succession, you do have a major disturbance, but not everything is destroyed, and you definitely still have soil. Okay, so let's talk about disturbances. There are actually four categories of disturbances, and they're two large categories. There's what kind in terms of who's responsible, and that's going to be natural and anthropogenic. And then there are time frames, and that's going to be catastrophic and gradual. And catastrophic in this case kind of means what it means in daily life, but really it just means that it's happening very fast. But it turns out that very fast changes are fairly difficult to deal with, and so they end up being most of the time catastrophic in the way that we mean catastrophic in our daily lives. But here's some examples. You could have a drought that's really bad, and that would cause catastrophic changes. Floods, fires, volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, landslides. Sometimes rivers change course. If you have flooding, for instance, it'll actually carve out a new riverbed. You can also have that as a gradual thing as rivers meander. And then also disease. If you have something that's particularly infectious or virulent, that'll actually wipe out a large part of the population, causing the ecosystem, the food web, trophic levels to crash, and that could be a huge change. But these are all natural. Okay, so some gradual things that are natural: climate change, immigration, and by immigration I mean invasive or introduced species, and we'll talk about those later on. Adaptation and evolution is a natural change. We'll talk about that in this unit as well. And then ecological succession is what we're talking about now. That is a natural gradual change. And then disease can also progress very slowly. Okay, so what about anthropogenic? All of the things that we do, and we are going to actually cover all of these things in this course at some point. We've already talked about overfishing. We've already talked a little bit about groundwater. Well, actually, we've talked a lot about groundwater depletion. We've talked a little bit about salinization. We'll talk about that in terms of soil later on. But all of the rest of these things we'll cover later. Okay, and then catastrophic, anthropogenic, would be a lot of things that we've talked about. Erosion, we talked about that, deforestation, and then overgrazing, plowing, mining, toxic contamination, and pollution are all things we're going to talk about later. And then fire is on here too in terms of catastrophic, because there are natural fires that actually, while they cause catastrophic change, end up being healthy. And then there are fires that we're responsible for, or there are natural fires that we accelerate, and those fires can be very problematic. And again, we'll talk about that later on in the course too. Okay, so let's talk about primary succession. So obviously you start with bare rock, right? The primary type of thing that you can have. And then that is going to be inhabited by lichen. And we'll talk about lichen later on. Lichen are very special. They're actually a symbiote. It's algae and fungi together. And they are so intertwined with their lives that they can't actually be apart, and so they become one organism, but it's actually these two together. But that's lichen. And then as those lichen anchor into the rocks, they begin weathering, right? And then as you start weathering, you get these smaller rocks and smaller rocks and smaller rocks, and you can start getting annual plants that can anchor in the smaller rocks, the gravel, or can actually anchor into the cracks in the rocks themselves, and they of course continue to weather. And you've also got all of your water cycle weathering, so the chemical weathering from dissolving, and you've got the ice and the abrasive action of flowing water and all this good stuff. So you're starting to build up a little bit of granular material, and that's what's going to be the mineral component of soil. And we'll talk about soil later on in the course too. But anyway, so you've got your small annual plants, and then those get replaced. As they start dying, they start putting organic material into the soil. And so now you get really like actual soil. And so you can start having some perennial herbs. And annual things are things that die at the end of the season. They may self-seed, they may not, but they're seasonal. Okay, and then perennials, they don't die, right? They may become dormant in the winter, or they might not, but they continue on season after season. You're also going to get grasses. As you start getting a buildup of more soil, you're going to start to get some shrubs, some different species of grasses, and then you're going to start getting some of your pine trees, your fir trees, your spruces. And these are what are called shade intolerant trees, and that means that they grow well in full sun, which works out well because at that point you don't have any big trees. But as those continue building up soil, and the roots are breaking down rocks, and you've got more organic material, you start getting this really rich, thick soil that can allow for the entrance of really big shade-tolerant trees. And these can be either deciduous or they can be coniferous. It kind of depends on what biome you're in. By the time you get to these really big, slow-growing trees, you're talking about your what's called a climax community, and this is sort of the end product of succession. But not all ecosystems get there. I mean, some of them get arrested in the grass right here because there's not enough water, perhaps, to feed these nice big trees. And so you'll see all kinds of different stages everywhere in the world. You know, different ecosystems might be different stages. But this is the ultimate possibility if you have the right abiotic factors. Okay, so here's your question. What kind of species begin the process of soil formation? Early, frontier, pioneer, or primary? You might be tempted to say primary because it's primary succession, but it turns out they're actually pioneers, and that works out with everything that you've learned about new people coming into areas. They are pioneers. Okay, so now here's your next question. Which of the following would be a pioneer species? A redwood tree, an oak tree, a holly shrub, or a lichen? Well, it's going to be a lichen, and that's what we said, and that's what I said, actually, when we were talking about the primary succession. The redwood tree and the oak tree, where would they be? That's right, climax communities. And then the holly shrubs are going to be in the independent phases, or the intermediate, not independent, the intermediate phases. Okay, so here's just another example of the primary succession, just to review. Exposed rocks, lichen and mosses, small annual, like your annuals, a little bit of small grasses, sometimes some shrubbery. Then you move into shrubs, and then you start getting these coniferous, fast-growing trees, the softwoods, right, the pines. Then you get your hardwoods. These are the slow-growing trees in the climax community. You need to be familiar with a couple of species that are this immature forest, and a couple of species that are in the climax community. Okay, so secondary succession, that's where you actually had some sort of ecosystem going on, and then something happened, but you still have all of the soil. And a really good example of that is when you have abandoned cropland or something like that. Annual plants come in first because that's pretty much the way. And then your grasses and your biennial herbs. Then you get your perennial herbs, and those actually start to replace the grasses. And then your pines come in, and then you get young oak and hickory trees. Your pines die out, and then these start to mature. And by the time these die out, you have a nice mature oak hickory forest, or these could be your like sequoia redwood forests, because those are also climax communities. It takes a lot less time. It takes hundreds of years for the primary succession phases to go through. This one, you can do this in as little as 100 years because you don't have to build up the soil. The progression is pretty much the same once you get the soil built up, but the key is having the soil there. Okay, so here's just what we were talking about before. Here's your annuals. They just come right on in. Your perennials, you move to shrubs, you move to the pines, move to the mature hardwoods, okay, softwoods, hardwoods. Just like primary succession, except this part right here. Okay, so consider the following scenario. After a balsam, birch, spruce community is established, a fire destroys most of the vegetated landscape, and thus secondary succession begins. At what stage do you think succession is likely to begin? Exposed rocks, lichen and mosses, small herbs and shrubs, heath mat, or none of these? Well, if you already had big trees and they're destroyed by fire, you're still going to have all the soil. So you're going to bypass 1 and 2, and you're going to move right on into the small herbs and shrubs. And so really secondary succession is going to pop in right at the number 3 here. Okay, so let's talk about, once you get the plants are going to dictate what kind of animals you're going to see in your ecosystem. And we're actually going to talk about this in the ecosystem notes that you're going to hear later on. But just know that it's climate and that dictates plants, and it's plants that dictate animals. So when you talk about your early successional species of wildlife, these are going to be things that all live on the ground. Now keep in mind, these occur generally after you have some grasses, okay, some of the annuals and grasses, because they need something to eat. A lot of these are going to be burrowing animals because there are no trees for them to live in, and so you've got all these nice little ground dwellers. Then your mid-successional species come in as you start getting more of the shrubbery and some of the really shade-intolerant pines, the young ones. And now you're going to get some more of the larger herbivores, the ones that are going to eat the bushes and the leaves and the grass. And you've got things that can live in shorter trees or in bushes. And then you move into the late successional species, and this is where you have some of the bigger conifers. And so you're going to have some of your, Hammond's flycatcher, by the way, is a bird, right? Just like a martin or any of the other birds on here. But this is one word, Hammond's flycatcher. But these are things that live in trees, or that they like shade or bushes or things like that. And then by the time you move into your climax community, you're going to have your mature species. This is where you start getting in your really large herbivores and your large carnivores, because if you don't have large herbivores, you can't have large carnivores because they won't have enough to eat. So that's kind of how it goes through there. And you can think about ecosystems that you've been in as you've been traveling, or, just wherever you happen to be, about what animals are around and how those relate to what plants you see. And you can kind of get an idea of where that ecosystem is in terms of succession. Okay, so here are just some different tolerances for trees. Please know at least one example from each of these categories: shade intolerant, intermediate, and shade tolerant. I put this in here. You can pick the ones you like. Alright, so when we look at these, over here, really, really common to this area, loblolly pines. Is this tolerant or intolerant? Well, it's intolerant because it needs to have the sun, right? So it's shade intolerant. Your little dogwood here, this would be shade tolerant because you can see all these nice big hardwoods around it, and it's growing just fine in the shade. A lot of your species in rainforest, tropical rainforest, are also going to be shade tolerant. Okay, so what are the factors that affect the rate of succession? There's facilitation, that's something that's going to help it. There's inhibition, that's something that's going to slow it down. And then there's tolerance, and that would be the ability to, it's essentially resilience. Okay, so facilitation this is where the plants that you have in one phase actually make the environment more suitable for other plants in a later stage. And so that may be adding nitrogen in the soil, organic material, breaking up, making deeper soil, whatever. But these allow for the process to continue. And this is really dictated by the biogeochemical cycles, which you learned in the last unit. And this is really important, especially when you're talking about your pioneer species, because those are the key to every species after that, because that's where you start building your soil. And no soil, no plants. All right, so inhibition is when your early species actually hinder the growth of other species. And a really good example of that is, we find them here in Texas, they're actually invasive, is the salt cedar. And we'll talk about the salt cedar later on in this unit, but the salt cedar is a kind of shrubby tree, and it lays down a salt ring around it, and so no other plants can actually grow in the vicinity of that. And so that's inhibition. Okay, and then tolerance is where you have species that are really just not affected by other plants. And so you can have late succession plants that are actually surviving in mature communities because they can tolerate each other, okay? And so they don't actually eliminate each other. And so you get kind of a larger diversity when you have these more tolerant plants. And because you've got a higher diversity, your system is going to be more resilient to change because you've got this nice stability because of the complexity. Complexity is the, having more levels, more species. Okay, so when we talk about ecological stability, there's two things. Resilience, we've already talked about. That's the bounce back factor. But inertia is the ability to resist disturbance, okay? And so it's how much can it take before you actually have a change. And then constancy is the ability of the system to maintain itself, right, within the limits of the available resources. And so the more constant your ecosystem, the less change that you actually see within it. Okay. So there's my clever PowerPointness. All right, so let's talk a little bit about aquatic succession, because not only do you have terrestrial ecosystems changing like that, but you also have aquatic. And this is going to begin along the shorelines, right? And it's going to involve a lot of leaves and sediment, and they accumulate on the edges. And so as you have this accumulation of sediment and leaves on edges, it actually makes the shore extend further out and the water gets shallower. And so what you have is a progression, and you can see this really nicely. You've got the actual open water, right? And then you've got this nice little wetland area where it's a little bit shallower and grasses are growing. And then as those die and sediments come in, as the water slows down, you have actual like soil, and then that moves up into standard terrestrial progression, okay? But basically what I'm saying is that lakes go to meadows. Lakes become meadows. All right, and so here's just an example. You've got the lake, you've got your sediment building up, you've got your plants, more sediment, and eventually you get to be a meadow. And this could take a short amount of time or a long amount of time. It kind of depends on the cycling of the plants and the amount of sediment coming in. Okay, so when you have along the shore, cattails are really common, right? And they are going to grow in the sediment. And they trap more sediment is how it works. And then once they start trapping more sediment, then you get the bushes, right? And as more soil is produced, you can get trees. First, you have trees that tolerate really wet soil and bright sunlight, and a good example of that is red maples. And then you get more shade, and you move into your climax community. And by this time, you have drier soil. It's not the nice wetland soil that you had before. And the soil's built up above the water table, and then you have all these shade-tolerant trees, and then your big trees too. Okay, and so after succession, what you get is actually going to depend on the ecosystem, okay? And so in the area in this picture, lakes become temperate deciduous forests. But if you had something, if you had something here, it would actually become a grassland, because we actually live in grasslands and we don't have enough rain to support big trees and big forests. So it really depends. Okay, it also is going to depend on the size of the water, right? Great Lakes are undergoing succession, but we're never going to see them as forests because they are huge and deep, but someday, thousands of years from now, they will not exist. They will be filled in. Okay, and so here's some other examples, right? Fast-running rivers don't actually allow for sediment to accumulate, and so they continue to flow, and as a matter of fact, they cause weathering and erosion. And deep lakes, really deep lakes, may actually stay for long periods of time if they're in areas where they don't have a lot of sediment. And so you really have to have sediment in plants in order for this to occur. So there are some exceptions to the rules. All right, but smaller bodies of water, if they're near a high erosion area, especially areas that don't have a lot of trees or plants, they're going to be more rapid. So a body of water here would actually fill in more rapidly than one that's in, say, a temperate deciduous forest. Okay, so who else speeds it up? Well, we do. Okay, because sometimes we have a lot of sewage that ends up in these streams and lakes, and fertilizers end up in these streams and lakes, and both of these actually cause plant growth. Animal waste products too can also do that. And so as these come in, you get both the sediment from that, and you also get more plant growth. Okay, and this is actually called eutrophication when you have all this plant growth, and it happens naturally, but naturally it'll happen slowly. And so you get this biogeochemical cycling, you get more plant growth, the plants die and fall to the bottom, and you actually get anaerobic conditions here, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but, well, essentially it works like this. The plant material dies and falls to the bottom as sediment, and the bacteria that consume it, that decompose it, actually they use up all the oxygen because they're heterotrophs, and so you get this anoxic area. And that can sometimes create dead zones. If you get a big enough dead zone, then you might not actually have any more progression, right, in your aquatic succession. But ultimately what will happen is that naturally eutrophication will cause a slow change. Anthropogenically it will cause a quick change. All right, so when we talk about this, you can compare your immature ecosystems to your mature ecosystems, early to late. And I've just put this in a table for you so you can kind of get a good idea of what's going on. Okay, so true or false? All disturbances to an ecosystem are detrimental. That is false, and we'll talk about later on a situation where fire actually is very beneficial for many ecosystems. Okay, so if you have any questions, please make sure to ask them and in the next class, and I will see you next time.